there's usually like maybe 40 or 50 8Ks filed. They're waiting for the markets to close and they're waiting to put negative information out there. I understand that a director resignation letter, I'm able to put it into context and say, this is really rare. You should be paying attention to this.
Sometimes the small print is where the biggest news gets buried. My guest today is Michelle Leader, founder of footnoted.com. For more than 20 years, she's built a career as the world's leading authority on digging into the footnotes of financial statements. And as a former hedge fund analyst myself, who used to be tasked with reading these financial statements, I've often felt that the statements themselves are long enough as it is. Who has time to read the footnotes? But I guess that's the point. It's smart to be reading what few people are. Anyway, we'll talk about Michelle herself, her love of digging into these footnotes, some red flags that you might want to watch for in companies you're investing in or considering investing in, and what sort of accounting changes might help avoid this cat and mouse game that companies play with the disclosures in the future. So, Michelle, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So, first of all, we talked about 20 years ago. I used to be at the Motley Fool, and so it's great to actually finally do this interview with you. What's your origin story? How did you get into this niche?
It's kind of a funny story. I mean, basically, I came out of traditional journalism. I had been a business journalist for for basically the first 10 years of my career. And so I thought that having covered a lot of companies, I covered IBM, I covered Tropicana, which was a unit of Seagram's at the time. I covered public companies. So I thought I knew, about, investing, right? Because I covered these things. And I bought some shares of Quest Communications back in the day. And, based on, I thought that they were, going to do great. And why does anyone buy a stock, right? Because you think it's going to go up for the most part, unless you're looking to short it. But I thought the stock was going to go up, and the stock, in fact, did not go up. And what I decided to do, not quite unlike, sort of medical students or, people like what you go back and you say, what went wrong? You do a post-mortem, basically. And so I went back and I looked at their SEC Quest most recent 10K and 10Qs. And I was like, wow, if I had spent, a couple of hours reading these, I would have seen enough red flags to, avoid this decision. I would have never bought this stock. And that was sort of a light bulb for me. That was the genesis of the book that I wrote called Financial Fine Print, Uncovering a Company's True Value. Again, this came out in, 21 years ago, almost, 1993. And I'm sorry, 2003, yep. 2003. And, what was really interesting to me was that was in the time of, Enron and, it was post-Enron, WorldCom. And there were companies that were literally, if you remember anything about Enron, basically they disclosed a lot of what they were doing, but they just disclosed it in sort of this, arcane language that made it really hard to figure out what they were doing. It
was there, but it was not there, kind of, yeah.
Yeah, it was physically there if you could figure out what they were trying to say. And this is, sort of at the root of the issue, right? The disclosure laws are very complicated. And, as an investor, think about this. You're going up against sophisticated attorneys and sophisticated financial people who are required to disclose certain things, but they're not required to write it in a clear fashion. And they're not required to tell you, hey, if you only pay attention to footnote 47 on page, 352 subsection B, you'll understand what's really going on at the company, right? You got to dig through. I joke around on my Twitter profile picture about how it's that kid from, finding the lottery ticket in the pile of poop in that famous Bollywood movie. So, that's what you kind of find here is like, there's a lot of like,
once told me the large print giveth and the small print taketh away, right?
Yeah. it's just, there's stuff there. And, especially now that we're coming out of 10K season, right? You're looking at some of these 10Ks, they're 800, 900, 1,000 pages long. Who has the time to read all this stuff? Even I don't read all of it. But you need to like kind of hone in and figure out what you should be reading if it's a significant investment for you.
Yeah, I want to ask about that because just quantity of research or number of companies to analyze is a challenge everyone faces in this industry, right? Especially if you're
Sure.
doing it kind of manually, not with some computer program. But just let me back up quickly. So you're running footnote.com now. Who is the typical customer of this service?
I would say it's more sophisticated investors,
Mm-hmm.
hedge funds, some regulatory authorities, regulatory agencies who are using it to supplement their own
Yep.
routine, analysis and um, plaintiffs' law firms, other law firms. That's primarily who it is, for. It's definitely not, it's funny. Think back to like the early days when I first joined Morningstar and I did a conference and I did this. I kind of explained the whole thing, and people were like, I don't want to bother with all this. I just want to know what stock to buy and when to sell it. And I was like, well, I'm probably not your girl for that. I'm sorry. And I'm not, it's not meant to be, there are certainly other products out there that will tell you when to buy a stock, when to sell it. They may be wrong, but they're out there. I don't do any of that. I don't, what I do is like, I focus on things that I think don't make sense, the disclosures in the filings. And I'll say something like, hey, this doesn't make sense for, just based on my knowledge of SEC filings. And those are the things that I think you need to pay attention to. One of the ways I like to think about this, Jim, is like, it's almost like if you think about going for your annual dermatology exam. I don't know if you're old enough to do that
I
yet,
do. I
but,
do. Unfortunately.
and they're kind of
Yeah.
looking at you and they're like, oh
Yeah.
yeah, this mold doesn't look good.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that one doesn't look good. You want to spot that in advance, right? Because if you wait until that mole turns into like, cancer, like a melanoma, you're kind of screwed, right? So you want to go. That's kind of one of the ways that I think about this is it's like almost like early detection. It's like your annual dermatology exam, or your 5-year colonoscopy, whatever comparison. It's kind of like an ounce of prevention.
And using the health metaphor as in terms of a societal benefit, what you're doing is extremely healthy. I mean, I love the pressure this puts on companies
Mm-hmm.
because they're so used to doing this and nobody really notices, right? Yeah. Footnote 47, who cares, right? This is really a wonderful, beautiful thing. Let me ask you about time management because I mean, it
Mm-hmm.
sounds granular, but to me, it's sort of important because as a former analyst myself, it used to be 7,000 stocks. Now it's 4,000 publicly traded stocks. Still way too many for the average
Yeah.
person to go through one by one, right? How do
Yeah.
you kind of like bucket your time? How do you decide how do I manage going broad versus going deep to find juicy nuggets?
Well, right now the product that I'm primarily focused on is what I call my Friday night dump. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
looking at filings that are made basically after 4 p.m. Eastern time on Friday nights,
Mm-hmm.
because the market's closed, but the SEC remains open for another hour and a half. And that's when companies tend to take out the trash. Back in the early days when I was a reporter, working in, I remember my first job at the Tampa Tribune, and it was like, the early days of fax machines, not to date myself too much, but it was the early days of fax machines. And like, you had this giant thing, the fax machine that would roll out the,
Yep.
crappy paper on that photosensitive paper, and it seemed like the ink would disappear almost as soon as it was printed.
And millennials watching have no idea what we're talking about, but
Yes, I
this was a
know.
thing. This was a thing. Yeah.
Gen X all the way.
Yeah.
Anyway, so companies would dump, like, they would put out a news release late on a Friday night. I mean, this isn't new. The government does it all the time. They want something buried, they'll put out something late on a
Yep.
Friday
Yep.
night or early on it's not like a big secret. And so here, the markets are closed at 4 p.m. Eastern time, but the SEC remains open for another 90 minutes. And that's when companies do take out, that's when they say, oh, by the way, our CFO resigned. Oh, okay. And don't think, I think a lot of people assume that, what I'm paying attention to is primarily the 8Ks, and people assume wrongly that 8Ks mean that the company put out a press release, or that the press release is identical to the 8K. And that's really not the case. Um,
And in any case, technically any
Certainly,
material announcement, right? If someone's
yeah,
new
I
to this,
mean,
yeah.
yeah, it's anything. It's actually not, when I talked to the folks at the SEC, it's technically, we think of it as any material announcement, but it's really, the definition is anything the average investor would want to know.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't actually use, at the SEC, they don't actually use the word material, but that's sort of the shorthand, right? That's, what you would say is like shorthand, anything material. But technically, well, what's material, right? Like, it's hard to come up with that definition. And something material to a company that's like has like 500 million in market cap might be very different to something, a company that has, let's say, 20 billion in market cap.
Yeah.
So the materiality issue can get started of a little gray area. But what I think is really important is, like, the reason that I focus on this is because that's when companies really do tend to put out the most negative information. So that's sort of the first layer. And then you kind of think of it like a layer cake, right? Like, so, okay, that's one screen. And then you're looking at, we just got out of 10K season. So what am I looking for in 10Ks? Can't read every 10K. You can't read every word of every 10K. So you got to kind of pick and choose. What do I pick and choose? I look for the risk factors. I look to see, what are companies doing? What's changed in the risk factors? Is that important? Maybe even the order of the risk factors. Maybe the company, because I think the most important thing to focus on is that companies spend a lot of time putting out this material, and yet so few people actually read it. And you think about the effort, the expense, the outside attorneys, the accounting firm, however many people are, involved with it on the internal side of the company, the vendor that actually gets it out to the SEC. So many people involved in it, you would hope that someone would actually read this stuff. And so I volunteered to read this.
You're that person, yeah. Do you trade based on your own research? And if not, are there any examples of, can you give us one or two that you sort of caught and say, okay, I caught something early before some bad thing happened, or maybe a good thing?
I do trade on my own research. I think that there's some really interesting things that you can find. And of course, like anything else, you want to look. The thing that I think gives me sort of a little bit of a competitive edge is that I'm looking at things that very few people are looking at, and I'm looking at them through my lens. And I would say in general, like 90% of what I find is probably negative. But there's probably maybe 10% on the positive side. Why is it 90% negative? It's because companies tend to bury the most negative stuff in footnotes late on a Friday night, early on a Monday morning. That's what I call my Monday morning dump. So, technically after the SEC closes the window, the Edgar system at 5:30 p.m. on a Friday night, they still remain open, but those filings are not available until 6 a.m. Eastern time on Monday morning.
Mm.
So let's say a company files at 8:30 at night on a Friday night. That filing is not visible to anybody until 6 a.m. on Monday morning. Or if Monday happens to be a holiday, then 6 a.m. Tuesday morning. So those are important. As for trading, I mean, I think back, like a great example is like Peloton. Back, I think it was about 2 years ago now, but they put out a filing on a Friday night saying that their head of their audit committee chairman was stepping down all of a sudden, or had stepped down all of a sudden a couple of days ago. And they're able to wait 4 days to disclose that because the SEC rules on 8Ks. So you have 4 days from the event to disclose it.
And so they deliberately waited those 4 days, which
they
says
waited
something.
those 4 days, yeah. So, let's say the guy resigned on, it's very common you see someone resigning on a Monday. It doesn't get disclosed until Friday night, especially if it's like a significant type of thing, like a CFO or an audit committee chair. I mean, obviously some directors and some officers have a higher weight than others, right? Like, if the deputy poobah of marketing resigns, I tend to not care all that much, or as much, I would say. But if it's like a chief technology officer or the CFO, or the accounting, the chief accounting officer, CAO, those are some things that you want to pay attention to. Now, of course, people step down from jobs for all sorts of reasons. Like it could be, a couple of weeks ago, I saw one that said that the guy was stepping down because someone in his family was sick. And I'm not going to ding the company for that. I've actually been through that myself. When my mother was sick, I kind of stepped away. And, I understand that. But like, if there's no reason given, that's sort of when my ears like prick up a little bit. So, with Peloton, the chair of the audit committee stepped down and they disclosed it. And you're thinking, like, why does an audit committee chairman step down all of a sudden out of the blue, blah, blah, blah. Well, it turns out that the stock just started, really sliding from there. It was one piece of bad news after the other. I think they restated earnings a couple of weeks later. And of course, anytime a company restates earnings, stock usually tanks there. So I think, like, it's looking for, like when I use that the skin diagnosis thing, it's kind of trying to find that early signal. What is the company really trying to say in between? Sometimes it takes like reading between the lines. Sometimes it takes trying to understand, like that Enron example. What are they really trying to say here?
Mm-hmm. Got it. So in the accounting kind of body of knowledge, we've got things like red flags are like accounts receivable growing faster than sales, or just generally getting more accrual income relative to cash and income. I mean, there are sort of like a standard group of things that are they're customary red flags. If we were to zoom in on sort of the footnote red flags, CFO resignation or maybe an audit committee resignation might be one of them. What are a couple of kind of like standard red flags that you might look for in footnotes per se?
I mean, I think, anytime the company adds some risk factors, whether it's like, you're seeing a lot of disclosures about, like the war situation, Israel Gaza war or Ukraine, or dependency on a particular vendor. There was a company a long time ago. It was called the GTAT was the ticker. And this one comes to mind because they warned that they were heavily dependent on Apple for, basically Apple was their largest customer. And they basically warned in the filing, if Apple changes its mind and decides not to, use us, we're kind of screwed. I mean, they used
Yeah.
obviously fancier language than that. It was all accounting and legalese and stuff like that. But what do you think happened? Lo and behold, a couple months later, Apple dropped them, like, just said that, hey, we're not using you anymore. And the stock went into bankruptcy. Literally, it filed for bankruptcy because it was like that dependent. So you want to look at things like that. I mean, I think, you have a lot of interesting disclosures that, it's hard to really rank them, but I would say, sort of the bread and butter disclosures are executives resigning. And I think that unless someone's going to a great new job, you have to ask yourself, well, why is this person suddenly resigning?
Yeah, especially if that person knows detailed information about the financial condition of the firm. Yeah.
And so I think, those are, sort of things. I mean, I think like when companies, I think one of the things I'm really interested in lately, and I've been noticing a pattern with this, is that companies will change the language in their forward-looking statements. For example, Cigna recently did this when they filed their earnings, and they talked about their reliance on artificial intelligence and that impact on that. Now, they didn't include that as a risk factor, but like what you often see is you'll see in the forward-looking statements, a company will trot out some language in there, and then eventually it turns into a risk factor down the road. And I think, you see like, maybe like warnings about cybersecurity. I mean, I was just looking at the one for United Healthcare. They just put out an 8K on Friday night. If you know anything about what's going on in the healthcare industry right now, it's like a huge mess with United Healthcare and then getting like individual doctors and healthcare providers getting paid. I think I read one estimate on Axios that it's costing $1 billion a day in lost revenue.
Ouch.
And because they got hacked, right?
Yeah.
And yet United Healthcare is saying, in their filing, like, we can't really, we don't know if this is going to be material or not yet. And I'm like, okay. I'm like, there's news articles that are saying like this is costing people $1 billion a day. How much further behind do you think the attorneys are who are going to say, hey, my client was harmed, they couldn't get this much revenue in? I mean, it seems like a no-brainer to me. So I think, what you need to do is like, you just need to pay. It's more about, and I just want to make this clear. It's more about paying attention to the language than the numbers. I've always been more about, there's lots of places that will say, oh, revenues went up, they went down, blah, blah, blah. This is about paying attention to the language and how the companies are disclosing things and what hidden things you can find in those disclosures.
It's interesting. It's really dependent on the context, basically. A company that did certain things a certain way before and suddenly changes, like that may be totally normal for a different company, but for for a prior company, for example, it might be meaningful, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of, or somebody resigns and they deliberately wait a certain number of days to disclose that, whereas maybe a different company might disclose it sooner. So it would probably be one of the harder things, for example, to train some AI program to look at, just because it's so relative. And let me ask you about this. Actually, speaking of context, you mentioned risk factors,
Mm-hmm.
and if anyone watching has read a 10K annual report, you've seen this huge dump of risk factors and blah, 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 blah,
Yeah.
everything under the suns, because they don't want to be, as Matt Levine jokes, everything is securities fraud. So if a company can
Mm-hmm.
list it, the CEO may hit his head walking into the bathroom, and this may impair the business, right? They want to list everything in advance. So I can understand. I'm a little bit sympathetic to companies trying to disclose everything to prevent or avert getting sued, but at the same time, it creates this dynamic for investors reading it like, oh my gosh, I got this huge long list, and these things are so like kind of watered down. It's hard to know what's meaningful or not. What's your view on that? I mean, are we too watered down?
I mean, it's hard. You can argue that, there is certainly amount of, CYA involved, right? Like companies like talking about anything that can happen. I mean, look at Meta, recently that in their 10K, speaking about Matt Levine, because he wrote a column about this. They had a new disclosure in their risk factor basically saying that, Zuckerberg likes to engage in extreme sports. And, the risk of doing extreme sports could be, sudden death, right? Anyone who does engages in extreme sports knows you got to usually sign that death waiver. I mean, I go kayaking a lot, not so much right now, but in general, like before you rent the kayak, you got to like sign the little waiver.
Yep, yep.
And kayaking is not even particularly extreme, right? So, um, but I think so. It's hard to say. Like, I mean, is it overkill? I think you can probably make that argument in some cases, but on the other hand, I would rather know than not know. Um, and I thought it was kind of interesting that they included that language in there. It's like, I mean, you kind of see these pictures of him doing extreme sports, right? But like,
Yeah, yeah.
I never really necessarily connected the dots. Like, could he die that way? I don't know.
But he could, right? And at least they're
Yeah,
trying. I mean, I guess maybe another example would be banks. Banks are extremely complicated,
yeah.
and I'm sure you've looked at bank filings, and I have too. And I remember one time, like I think it was Bank of America. I don't want to say that for sure, but I'm one of some big bank basically. Like I remember like reading some sort of like headline bullet points they'd provided, and then going into the filings. And the filing
Hmm.
itself is a couple hundred pages, and then there are these
Yeah.
appendices which themselves also are a couple hundred pages. I was trying to reconcile this headline number, like so and so was up 18%. I couldn't. And I'm a
Mm.
trained analyst. Like I had to call the company to have them. Okay, well this here and this here, and like it was a little bit of like magic at the same time. So they were trying to be dutiful and disclose like all this stuff, which on paper is good, but at the same time, it creates this problem of just quantity of information, kind of like getting lost in a crowd. And so I'm not sure that it really helped me. So, I mean,
Yeah.
just what I'm saying makes sense. Do we have a problem of too much information, or are they just trying to be good?
It can be, it can come across that way. I mean, like, I think it was Arthur Levitt who, like, 20 something years ago when I was first starting out, had, tried to do this plain English. I think it was back in 1998, if I remember correctly. He had this plain English push for SEC filings. Has that happened 25 years later?
I would say not. Yeah.
I would say no. I mean, you can still find the paper about SEC filings in plain English and the push for that. But I mean, are these filings largely written, in plain English? I would say no. I think what's going to be interesting because, you're seeing a lot of this, pressure on law firms, especially on sort of this routine disclosure type of stuff. Will AI start writing these routine disclosures and how will that impact, right? Like you don't need a high powered attorney to do like, to write a basic risk factor. You could probably get AI to do that right now or tweak it to a certain extent. I don't know. I think that'll be interesting to watch for, like in terms of the filings. Will AI help make the filings easier to read or harder to read?
Yep.
And will there be a great tool in AI's basket to help read the filings better? There's certainly
To
services
read
out
the
there
AI
that are,
written filings, AI
yeah,
reads the
yeah.
exactly.
I mean, there's certainly services out there that are touting their AI bona fides and saying like, hey, we can cut through filings. We know what the risk factors are. But I think I saw a study not too long ago that was basically found, an academic study that basically found that AI kind of failed the task in reading SEC filings because
Hmm.
they are
Hmm.
too complicated. They're not written in plain English. It's not like, if you ask a question in AI, like summarize Little Red Riding Hood, you're saying like summarize the top 5 risk factors in Bank of America's most recent 10K and compare it to, the 10K a year earlier. I don't know. I don't know how AI is doing on that. I would say that it's complicated.
Yeah, presumably it takes things at face value, and a lot of this, as we mentioned, is very context dependent, and you're looking at subtle changes,
Yeah,
relative changes rather than absolute changes.
yeah.
Let me shift gears, Michelle. There are a cluster of people, and I know some of them who are big on the shareholder voting. Like shareholders should not be so passive. You open
Hmm.
that blue envelope, or these days it's all digital, right? And
Yeah.
vote, and it matters, and show the company that you care. But there's also a logic that it doesn't really matter, right? These are non-binding votes in many cases. What's your view on shareholder voting?
I mean, look, on the stocks that I own, I do try to vote. And I say try. I don't always, I wouldn't say my voting record is 100%. But I do find that you're asking me to vote. I mean, look at, under Dodd-Frank, right? Like they had this whole thing about you have to approve the executive compensation. So now every year, every company has a vote. They put a vote to shareholders. Do you approve of the executive compensation, for our board, for our executives, right? Executive compensation. And, sometimes these votes lose, and there have been losses at very large companies. And does anything change? No. Does the executive
It's just
compensation
a
change?
symbolic vote. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's
It's
nice to know
just,
what they think, but it's not a real vote in a way.
and whose problem is this? Is it a problem of Congress that created this legislation? Is it a problem? I would say that that's part of the problem. You're putting this vote, but there's no consequences for the vote. And maybe Congress couldn't have done anything about that. Maybe they could have just inserted legislation that said, we're requiring you to put this vote to shareholders, but we can't do anything about whether you accept that vote because that's obviously, your own, bylaws or whatever, individual bylaws. But it's just like, I guess there's like, some like, maybe I'm just being a little cynical here, but like, why ask me to vote for something if like my vote doesn't count?
Yeah, like
And I
monopoly
know
money
people
is. Yeah.
say that. I know people say that about elections and everything like that. I mean, we just had an election. I'm currently in Paris right now, but I actually voted in my local school board election back in Los Angeles by
Hmm.
mail because I was like, the school board was really important to me.
Hmm.
My kid is going to be back at that school next year, and it was important to me to vote in that election. Um, I think that, people think like, oh, local elections don't count or other elections don't count. But in this, those elections actually do count. It's these shareholder votes. I mean, I've seen situations where a director gets, a majority of negative votes or no
Hmm.
confidence votes. Sometimes it's structured in different ways. Sometimes it says no confidence. Sometimes it says abstain or no vote or whatever, but they remain on the board. And so the question is like, why, I think you can make a valid argument. Why go through this if nothing happens? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, speaking of things that might be better, if we
Hmm.
shift to GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles, or IFRS, International Financial Reporting Standards, those are the two kind of main accounting rules. If you had a magic wand and could make one or a few changes to make them better, what would you do?
I think I would try to come up with some kind of, systematic way to compare companies in the same industry. That was what XBRL was supposed to do.
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
allow you to compare, like, let's say JP Morgan to Citi to Bank
Hmm.
of America to Wells Fargo to, and so when they said that, this revenue, recurring revenue, and it was like something that you can actually say, okay, this is apples to apples. But XBRL did not work that way, and companies started filing, like coming out with different tags and all of that. So, I mean, I think in general, I'm less focused on the accounting and I think, if I had like a magic wand, if I can like, shake the SEC into submission, I would say when companies say that somebody resigned, whether it's the auditing firm or an executive or a director, and they say there were no disagreements, no disputes, come on. Do you really give up a job that pays you $300,000 a year part time if there's no disputes? It just doesn't meet the sniff test, right?
And so what would be the takeaway? Like just explain the dispute basically, or
Explain
have
or
a
explain,
video interview with the guy or something like that? I mean,
explain in a little bit more detail. I mean, I think like, what you get, I just did a LinkedIn post on this last week because at Werner, the large trucking company, there was actually a director who submitted a letter that stated his dispute. He said that he felt that there were too many related party transactions at the company and that's why he resigned. But, those types of letters are so rare. Like, I think, I had the folks at Verity Research run it, and they found 50 of these letters in the past 5 years.
Wow.
So think about that. 50.
That rounds to zero almost in terms
Yeah,
of number of
exactly.
yeah,
The number of directors resigning, the number of board members, it rounds to zero. And so I would like to, I understand that maybe they can't be super honest, but like, I think like the broad language, I mean, even in my own, on my own newsletter, when I say like standard language on no disputes was used. And that's just sort of my shorthand, like, this is what the company says. Do I believe it? Probably not. I think that would be the one thing that I would change if I could. And I think the voting too is important. Don't ask me to vote on a director or don't ask me to vote on executive compensation. If my vote is irrelevant, you're going to do whatever you want to do, no matter how I vote. I mean, it's just that I think, in theory, they're asking for shareholders to be involved and you want to be involved. But if you see that your vote doesn't count, then it's kind of frustrating, right? Like, if you vote against the executive compensation because maybe you think the guys weren't doing a great job in the past year and the stock's gone down X percent, but they're still getting paid the same amount of money, or they got like some kind of huge stock option or whatever, maybe you want to vote against that. But it doesn't matter if you vote against it because
they're going to do it anyway.
Chances are it's going to be in place anyway.
It's almost insulting to shareholders, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those would be the things that I would change on,
So if someone's watching this and says, I want more, Michelle Leader, where would you send that person?
Oh, just go to my site, footnoted.com. My product is called the Friday Night Dump. It's a subscription-based newsletter. It goes out to subscribers on Monday morning before, and it's really a curated view on a typical Friday night after 4 p.m. Just to put it into perspective, there's usually about 150 8Ks that are filed during that 90-minute period.
Wow.
150. And during the 10 hours prior, because the SEC opens at 6 a.m., so from 6 a.m. until 3:59 p.m., there's usually like maybe 40 or 50 8Ks filed. And then all of a sudden they really, that's
they're deliberately waiting for those 90 minutes. Very clear.
They're waiting for those. They're waiting for the markets to close and they're waiting to put negative information out there.
Wow.
And that's not to say that every one of those 145 filings are negative or companies worth paying attention to. But I think that's what I'm providing like a curated view of those filings. So I'm saying like, here's the 5 or 6 that you really do need to pay attention to. Like the Werner example that I gave, that was the type of thing. It's so, and someone like me, because I've been doing this for so long, I understand that a director resignation letter, I'm able to put it into context and say, this is really rare. You should be paying attention to this. This is something that's worth your time.
Exactly. And as someone who's at least tries to be civic minded in the sense of the investor community, I'm so glad you're doing this, Michelle. I mean, we need people like you. We need the spotlight on these things. We need these things to be called out. As Charlie Munger says, or to paraphrase him, show me the motivation, I'll show you the behavior. And companies clearly have this window and they're clearly using it, based on those numbers you gave. So I'm glad we need more Michelle leaders out there as far as I'm concerned. So Michelle, thank you so much for joining me today. And of course, thanks to you guys watching as always as well.